I have sat on both sides of the interview table, as the candidate and as the person doing the hiring. And here is something I learned sitting on the hiring side that's changed how I think about every interviews I have done since. I've seen candidates lose the role because they gave the right answer to the wrong question. They answered what was asked, not what was actually being evaluated. Today, I'm giving you 7 of the hardest questions in a business analyst interview, and more importantly, what the interviewer is really listening for underneath each one. This is not generic interview advice. This is what I have seen work and what I have seen fail from a decade on both sides of the table. Hi, I'm Jules, Senior Business Analyst, over a decade in finance and fintech, and founder of Solstice HQ, a career acceleration platform for BA and PM professionals. I have interviewed candidates for BA roles. I've also coached candidates through BA interviews, and I have sat in 5-round processes myself, including one where I was told a role had been created for me, and then I heard nothing back. That experience taught me something important. A good interview is not about saying impressive things. It's about demonstrating in real time that you think like a BA. This video is for 2 people. If you're transitioning into BA for the first time, these 7 questions are the ones that will test whether you can think like a BA, not just talk about wanting to be one. And if you're an experienced BA, these are the questions that separate a candidate who sounds senior from a candidate who actually demonstrates seniority in the room. Both groups stay through to the end. The pattern underneath all the 7 questions is the same, and once you see it, every interview gets easier. Here's what we're covering. 7 questions for each one. I will give you what is actually being tested, the wrong way most people answer it, and the framework for the right way to answer it. And at the end, I'm going to give you the one thing you should do in every single interview, regardless of which question comes up, that I've personally seen change outcomes more than any clever answer has. Stay to the end for that. It's the single highest leverage thing in this video. Let's start with a question almost everyone gets wrong in the first 30 seconds of an interview. Tell me about yourself. This sounds like small talk. It is not. What is actually being tested? Can you communicate concisely? Do you understand what is relevant to the specific role? And can you tell a coherent professional story rather than a chronological list of jobs? The wrong way most people answer this. They start from the university. They walk through every job in order. They speak for 4 minutes. The interviewer's attention leaves somewhere around minute 2. For the transitioner, the wrong answer often sounds like, well, I started in operations and I moved into finance, and now I'm looking to transition into BA because. That structure signals uncertainty before you have said anything useful. For the experienced BA, the wrong answer often sounds like a full work history recited in chronological order, with no clear thread connecting any of it to the role in front of them. The framework that works: present, relevant past, future. State who you are right now in BA terms. Give the 1 or 2 process or past experience most relevant to this specific role. Then connect it to why you're interested in this opportunity specifically. 90 seconds, no more. For a transitioner, for instance, I'm a professional with 8 years in financial services operations, specializing in process analysis and requirements documentation. I've spent the last 2 years formally building BA skills, including at your credential. And I'm looking for my first BA role in a finance, fintech, or health environment where I can apply both my domain knowledge and my BA training. That is 40 seconds. It is specific. It does not apologize. Question 2 is the one that catches almost every transitioner off guard. Why do you want to be a business analyst? What is actually being tested here is, do you understand what the role actually involves day to day? Or do you have a romanticized idea of it? Hiring managers can tell the difference immediately. Here's the wrong answer. I enjoy problem solving and working with people. That answer could apply to almost any job in existence. It tells the interviewer nothing. Here's the framework. Name a specific BA function. Connect it to something you have already done, and be honest about why it appeals to you specifically. For instance, I'm drawn to the part of the BA role that sits between business need and technical delivery. In my current role, I found myself naturally doing that translation work, gathering what stakeholders need, and making sure it gets communicated clearly to the people building the solution. I want to do that formally with the right framework and tools behind it. That answer demonstrates you understand the actual function of the role, not the title, the function. Question 3. And this one is very important for both audiences equally. Tell me about the time you dealt with a difficult stakeholder. What is actually being tested here is, can you manage conflict professionally? And do you take ownership rather than blaming the other person? Here's the wrong answer. A story where the stakeholder is clearly the villain, told with visible frustration, ending with, and eventually they came around. That tells the interviewer you may be difficult to manage when stakeholders push back on you in this role. The framework to use the STARL, which is a situation, task, action, result, and lesson learned. But the critical addition to this question specifically is adding what you learned or what you would do differently. For instance, a stakeholder disagreed with a requirement I had documented because it conflicted with how the team currently worked. Rather than defending my documentation, I asked to understand their current process in more detail. It turned out there was a business rule that I had missed. I revised the requirement, and from that point, the stakeholder became one of the most collaborative people on the project because they felt heard. That story shows curiosity over defensiveness. That is precisely what a hiring manager wants in a BA. For transitioners without a BA example, this works perfectly from any role. A disagreement with a colleague, a customer, a cross-functional partner, the skill being demonstrated is identical regardless of title. Quick pause here. If you want a structured way to prepare stories like the one I just gave for every common BA interview question, I have a resource at Sources HQ that includes a full interview preparation worksheet using this exact framework. Link is below this video, worth grabbing before you keep watching because we're about to get into the harder questions. Question 4 is the one that explodes whether someone actually understands requirements or just knows the word. Here it is. How do you handle a situation where requirements are unclear or ambiguous? What is actually being tested here is, do you have a method or do you just guess and hope? Now, here's the wrong answer. I would ask the stakeholder for more information. Technically true, completely insufficient. Every candidate says some version of this. It does not differentiate you. Here's the framework. Give an actual method, not a feeling, a process. For instance, when requirements are ambiguous, I start by identifying what specifically is unclear. The business rule, the scope boundary, the success criteria. I then go back to the stakeholder with specific targeted questions rather than an open-ended one. Can you clarify this? If the ambiguity persists, I'll drift my interpretation and present it back to them to confirm or correct, because sometimes seeing a concrete version makes the gap obvious where a conversation does not. That answer demonstrates a method. Method are what gets hired. Good intentions do not. Question 5 is the one that has become standard in almost every BA interview in the last year, and most candidates are not ready for it. Here it is. How do you use AI in your day-to-day work? What is actually being tested is, are you currently relevant or are you operating like it's still 3 years ago? Here's the wrong answer. I haven't really used it much, or a vague one. I think AI is really interesting with no specific example. In this market, that answer is a great disqualifier. Here's the framework. Give one specific real example and critically include how you validated the output. That validation piece is what separates a BA who uses AI from a BA who blindly trusts it. Now, here is my answer. I use AI to produce a first draft of requirements documentation from meeting transcripts. It saves significant time on the initial structure, but I always treat that draft as a starting point, not a final answer. I go through it line by line against my own notes and stakeholder conversation because AI tools miss organizational context and sometimes invent details that sound plausible but are not accurate. That validation step is, in my view, now a core part of the BA skill set. That answer demonstrates exactly the judgment that AI cannot replace, which is precisely what hiring managers are listening for right now. Question 6. This is the one that genuinely separates mid-level from senior candidates. Here it is. Tell me about a time you had to push back on a decision made by someone more senior than you. What is actually being tested is, do you have the professional courage to challenge upward, and can you do it without damaging the relationship? Here's the wrong answer. Version 1. I've never really had to do that. I usually trust leadership judgment. This signals you will not challenge bad decisions when it's really, really important. The wrong answer, version 2. A story where you were combative or where the story ending is, I was right and I had to admit it. This signals you may be difficult to work with. Now here's the framework. Show that you raised the concern with evidence, framed it around a shared goal rather than being right, and respected the final decision even if it did not go your way initially. Here it is. A senior stakeholder wanted to proceed with a solution that I believed would create a compliance risk based on my analysis. I raised it directly, brought the specific regulation and the risk in writing, and proposed an alternative that met their timeline. They reviewed it and we adjusted the approach. What matters most to me was not winning the disagreement. It was making sure that the risk was visible before a decision was finalized. That story shows judgment, courage, and respect for hierarchy all at once. That combination is rare and highly valued. For transitioners, this works from any professional context. The skill is the same, raising a concern with evidence, not emotion, and focusing on the shared outcome. And the seventh question, the one that closes almost every interview, and the one most candidates fumble because they did not prepare for it specifically, even though they knew it was coming. Why should we hire you over other candidates? What is actually being tested here is, can you synthesize everything you've said in the interview into a confident, specific closing argument, or do you fall back on generic claims under pressure? Here's a wrong answer. I'm a hard worker and a fast learner, and I'm really passionate about this opportunity. Every candidate in every interview for every job says some version of this. It is forgettable specifically because it is generic. Now, here's the framework. Name the one thing or two things that are genuinely differentiated about you, tie them directly to something you heard the interviewer say earlier in the conversation, and close with confidence. Here's my example. You mentioned earlier that this role sits at the intersection of regulatory compliance and digital transformation. That intersection is exactly where I have spent the last 4 years specifically translating compliance requirements into technical specifications for engineering teams. That is a narrow combination, and based on our conversation today, it is precisely what this role needs. That clause does three things at once. It demonstrates active listening throughout the interview. It positions you as specifically differentiated, not generally qualified. It ends the interview on a note of quiet confidence. Now, the one thing I promised you, the highest leverage thing in any interview, regardless of which question comes up. Ask a real question at the end. Not, what are the next steps? Not, what is the culture like? A real question specific to something said in the interview that demonstrates you were thinking critically throughout the conversation. Here it is. You mentioned the team is migrating to a new core system in the next 2 quarters. What does success look like for the BA function specifically within that migration? That single question does more to demonstrate strategic thinking than almost anything else you can say in an interview. Because it shows you were not just answering questions, you were analyzing the role the entire time, which is in fact exactly what a business analyst does. I want to go back to something I shared in the earlier video. I once sat through 5 rounds of the interview, was told a role had been created for me, and then received complete silence. Looking back, I do not know exactly what happened on the other side of that process, but what I do know is this. The way you show up in an interview is the only part you can control. Prepare the substance, ask the real question, and then let the outcome be what it is, because a process that goes silent on a qualified candidate is telling you something about that organization, not about you. If you want to prepare for this exact 7 questions with structured practice and real feedback, if you're transitioning into BA for the first time, the 4 program includes interview preparation built specifically around demonstrating BA thinking, even without a BA title yet. If you're an experienced BA, the Career Accelerator includes mock interview coaching using this exact framework tailored to your specific experience and target roles. Both programs are at solsticehq.io. Links are below. If this video helped you, hit like and subscribe. Next week, I'm covering salary negotiation, specifically the exact script for asking for more once you have an offer in hand. That one goes live next Friday. I'm Jules Ijere, and this is Solstice HQ. You do not need a perfect answer to every question. You need to walk in thinking like the BA they already need. See you next week.